You're listening to the B&H Photography Podcast. For over 40 years, B&H has been the professional source for photography, video, audio, and more. For your favorite gear, news, and reviews, visit us at bnh.com or download the B&H app to your iPhone or Android device. Now here's your host, Alan Weitz.
Greetings and welcome to the B&H Photography Podcast. According to my notes, today is going to be a great show, and I have little doubt that it will be. We are very excited to welcome photographer Lester Sloan and author Aisha Sabatini Sloan, who not coincidentally is Lester's daughter and co-author of their book, Captioning the Archives, A Conversation in Photography and Text. Captioning the archives is the kind of endeavor that I think would thrill any photographer, particularly a news photographer. And in conversation with his daughter, Lester's photos become a personal story, a family story, an intergenerational meditation in which we are fortunate to be included in today. See, I told you it's going to be a terrific show, just like my notes said. So let's offer an introduction to our guests. Lester Sloan began his photography career as a cameraman for the CBS affiliate in Detroit, then worked as a staff photographer at Newsweek magazine for 25 years. He's documented the 1967 uprising in Detroit, the kidnapping of Patty Hearst, the fall of the Berlin Wall, and the O.J. Simpson trial. Lester was also a contributing editor to Emerge magazine and an essayist with NPR's Weekend Edition. He's the recipient of the prestigious Neiman Fellowship and was the on-set photographer for Spike Lee's 1996 film Get on the Bus. Aisha Sabatini Sloan is a writer whose essays about race and current events are often coupled with analysis of art, film, and pop culture. Her 2017 book, Dreaming of Ramadi in Detroit, was chosen as the winner of the 1913 Open Prose Contest, and she's also the recipient of the 2020 National Endowment for the Arts Award. This year, she received the National Magazine Award for essays written for the Paris Review. Lester and Aisha, thank you both for joining us, and congratulations on this book. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Great to have you here. Let's start with the book's title. Whose idea was it first? Who planted the seed with who?
Well, I think for the title, that would be me. I have been such a fan of my father's stories for so long and just wanted to find the right container for them, so to speak. And it felt like captions were just the right genre for it. I'm a real fan of conceptual art, I suppose, that plays with the idea of a caption, like Lorna Simpson's photographs, which have really dynamic, thought-provoking I guess captions isn't necessarily the word that one would use for it, but image-text collaboration, and Sophie Calle, a lot of image-text work that I've found really fascinating sort of plays or riffs on the idea of a caption. So I thought it would be cool if our conversations sort of were limited in that way, so that it wasn't terribly profuse, but sort of contained in the idea of a limited description of a photograph, but also kind of a little bit tongue-in-cheek, because the captions really spill over, because a lot of my father's stories sort of open out into other stories. So we decided to go with that as the title, but it is some sort of a mouthful.
So it's sort of expanded captions or mini essays in a way. Would that be fair?
Yeah.
Now, here's something that just comes. I'm listening to you talk, and you mentioned, you know your father's photographs, and no doubt you've heard stories of many of these photographs at the time that they occurred. And we're talking about decades of imagery here. Now, something I'm just curious about, and I don't know whether you've noticed it or whether your dad knows or anybody, has time colored any of the narratives of these stories?
Dad, do you want to take that one?
Really, a lot has changed, but in another respect, nothing has changed. The idea of my daughter being involved with my work was something just came naturally. I have an older daughter who was with me when the Detroit riots started. I simply took my daughter home to my mother, and I went back out and started shooting. And my children have always been a part of my life. I mean, what I do and why I do it, they I can see it reflected in them. I'm not surprised that Aisha came up with the idea of doing this book. It's just a continuation of something that's always been there. She started traveling with us, my wife and I, when she was 2 years old. She was on my wife's passport. And she reached a point where, next thing I know, she was off to South Africa by herself.
Do you feel like the way you've told the stories has changed over the years, the stories of those photographs, maybe to me and Lisa, to your family? Or do you feel like they've changed, they've stayed the same?
I think they stay the same. I mean, it's the stories. I've added more as times have changed. The book was evolving, even though we didn't know there was a book to be done.
Obviously, there's more than photography involved here. I mean, Lester, in addition to being a photographer, you're a writer and a collector of oral histories, and obviously, there's a lot here that you recognize what was happening. It seems to me that you are a storyteller in a sense who happens to use a camera. Is it just coincidental that you're a photographer, or is your real goal to be the storyteller and collector of stories for history?
I had no choice. I won a camera selling subscriptions to the Detroit Free Press when I was 10 years old.
Love it.
I still have that camera.
Love it even more.
I had an uncle who took pictures all the time, not just pictures of weddings, parties, or that, but everything he did I could find it in some photographs he had made. So it was there. It was preordained that I chose photography to tell stories. Yes, but I also did a lot of writing and reporting for Newsweek. And I got in the habit of suggesting stories to Newsweek magazine before I even was hired by Newsweek magazine. For instance, in Detroit, at the library where I work as a young man, we would oftentimes have guests in for doing one thing or another, giving talks or what have you. And I would be assigned the job of taking pictures, or I assigned myself to take pictures, and those pictures followed me throughout my career. I just found out that pictures that I took of Ossie Davis and Ruby Dee with their children in the 1960s, I forgot I'd taken the pictures. And I didn't remember that until my daughter brought it to my attention that, Dad, did you know that you have pictures of... I said, that doesn't surprise me. I took pictures of everything that happened during that time. That's when I got started seriously considering photography as a career. So it was serendipity, yes, but somehow I think this was supposed to happen because I became curious about everything. I got a grant one year to go to Germany to check out the lives of American soldiers in Germany or blacks in Germany. Now, one reason I did this is my father was part of the Normandy invasion.
Mm-hmm.
He went all the way up to he went through France and elsewhere. But I remember, I didn't find this out until the O.J. Simpson situation when his wife was killed, who, by the way, lived a half a block from where we were living when we lived in California. I didn't know anything about that until my father's career in Germany, until I got home. My father was in the hospital. My wife said, you got to go to Detroit. I've made reservations for you. So my father and I watched the Bronco chase on television. And then he said, where have you been? And I said, I just got back I did the 50th anniversary of the Normandy invasion. And he said, I was there.
And you had no idea
I
prior to
had
this?
no idea. Fathers, I've found out, white or black, did not talk about their war experiences. At one time, I wanted to buy an apartment in the south of France. And I was telling my dad about that, and he said, he sort of leaned back in his bed and he said, the south of France. I said, what are you talking about? He said, nothing. I can't talk about that.
Now, from what I understand, by the way, the experience of Black soldiers in Europe was very different from the experience of Black soldiers here in the States during and after the war. And my understanding from stories I've seen and heard is that a lot of Black soldiers ended up staying there because they were respected more there and basically led better lives.
When Caspar Weinberger was Secretary of Defense, I read a story in the New York Times that said the German government had asked the Americans to stop sending so many Black troops to Germany. And immediately I asked to go. I wanted to go and see about. Now, strangely enough, the only objection came from the bureau chief at the time, Newsweek. He said, "Don't bother with that. That's not worth doing," and all that. This was a story that some of the editors of Newsweek didn't want to see or didn't want to be bothered with. But I remember they told German soldiers that any Americans, Black Americans visiting, were probably spies and don't associate with them. I couldn't understand why, whenever I met a Black soldier in Germany, I would speak, they would ignore me. And then one day I'm in Berlin. I'm walking down the street and I see this guy coming. I could tell he's a GI by his haircut and all that. And he walked by me and he said, "Hey, man, what's going on?" And I didn't say a word. I just kept walking. And then I heard somebody laughing behind me and said, "They pull that stuff on you too." And I said, "Okay, tell me what the hell's going on." And he says, "Well, they tell us that any Black person visiting Germany is probably a spy, so don't associate with them." I mean, they told this lie. So when I went there to do a story, I had a young lady taking me around to the clubs where Black soldiers hung out, this, that, and the other, and then it came time, the end of the day, evening, I said, "Okay, I'm going to take you back to your base." She said, "I don't live on a base." I said, "Where do you live?" She said, "Just drive. I'll take you there." So I started driving, and we come to a house in a residential area, and it was a house for guest workers, Gastarbeiters. And I said, "So what's the deal here?" She said, "No, you tell me about who sent you here and why." And I told her my story and all that. And she had her hands in her lap. And when I finished telling her the story, she folded something in her hand. It was a straight razor. And I said, "Okay, what's that all about?" She said, "I was going to off you because I thought you'd been hired to off me." That's how crazy things were in Germany. I mean, it's a story that nobody knew anything about.
I wanted to actually follow up a little bit about some of the aspects of working at Newsweek, and you seem to hint at it a little bit there about pitching some of your own stories and how they were received. But could you give us a little picture of how life was as a staff photographer for Newsweek at that time? Obviously, this is the kind of job that has somewhat disappeared, and a lot of photographers look back to this era as kind of a golden era of photojournalism. But how did it work for you? I mean, did you feel that you were able to tell some of the stories that you wanted to? Did you have much say in the assignments that you were doing? And How was the camaraderie and the sense of place when you were a staffer at Newsweek?
Well, first of all, I'm grateful that at Newsweek, because of certain editors, I was allowed to be a reporter and a photographer. And many assignments I had, I was told to go out and take the pictures and write the story. So Newsweek offered me opportunities that I didn't expect, didn't come from any other place. I mean, I was lucky in that regard. But I also knew that there was an agenda. For instance, I was asked once to go out and photograph welfare mothers, and we were doing a story about welfare and those who were cheating and this, that, and the other. And I called the welfare department in California, and I talked to a lady, and I said, look, I'd like 6 typical welfare mothers. She said, okay, I'll help you with that. And I said, I need them by next week. She said, I'll have them in a day or so. And she gave me 6 names, and I went out and photographed 6 white women. And I turned the film in, needless to say, my editors went berserk. What the hell is this? I said, what's missing? They're all welfare. She said, you know what I'm talking about. What the hell is this? Anyway, they assigned another photographer to go out to shoot the same thing, a black photographer. And he photographed a woman who had 4 kids, 2 at her knee, 1 in her arm, and 1, I forget, there were 4 altogether. Behind her were pots and pans with food spilling over, burned on the stove, and what have you. And this was their mother. This is what they wanted. This is why I caught hell for what I turned in. Now, I called the welfare department and says, look, they were upset with what you guys gave me. And she said, how can a group of people who are 1/4 of the population account for all, be an example of the typical welfare mother? Typical welfare mother is white. She has 3 or 4 kids. Same things that go on in a lot of families like that. They end up on welfare because there's lack of support.
Mm-hmm.
But
did you feel that you were often getting assignments that other photographers might not have been getting? Do you think that there was some kind of I don't know, let's send Lester or another black photographer to cover black stories, quote unquote? Was there anything like that going on, or did you feel that there was kind of a fair dispersion of the work?
The photographer that who went out and shot the cover worked for the magazine. He was a researcher there, but he was a good photographer. And he became the go-to person for the stories that they wanted. But how we cover, what we cover, and how we cover it makes a difference.
But Dad, in terms of coverage and being, asked to do specific assignments, isn't that kind of how you got your start with Newsweek? Because I thought you had said something about how white photographers were scared to cover the 1967 uprising Detroit or riot in Detroit. And that's part of how you got the job.
Well, that was a need for. I got my first assignment at Newsweek because of the riot. I went to the Detroit Free Press and offered my pictures, and they said, we have all the pictures we need, but Newsweek magazine's upstairs. You can check with them. I went up. I told them what I had. I gave them my film and all that. Then I go back home. I was staying with my mother and father. I go back home, and my mother said, Newsweek called. I said, yeah, I just left there. She said, they called from New York. How could you have just left there? And I got on the phone, and they said, we'll pay you $300 a day to go out and shoot pictures. $300 a day?
Wow.
Back that, yeah, that was good bucks back then. And by the way, the rate hasn't gone up much, unfortunately.
But it
So,
was, I think, you got that extra $50, $150 because it was a riot,
yeah.
and I covered the Chicago convention after I had a job with CBS. I took vacation time to cover the Chicago convention, and that was an eye opener as well. I mean,
And Lester, were you working on your own photos at the time also? Were you always kind of keeping an eye out for stories that maybe you wanted to tell or images you wanted to make that were separate from the assignments?
I didn't know it at the time, or didn't think about it at the time, but I was doing stories about black males in Detroit. I mean, everybody talks about the racism that existed. I grew up in a neighborhood where there were only 3 black families within a 1-block area. There was Jeffrey Martin and his family who lived on the corner of Canfield and Baldwin. There was Danny Collins who lived across the street from me and his family. And then there was Rodney McDonald, who was my closest friend, who lived down the street. Now, we didn't suffer that. We played hockey in the backyard with a tennis ball, and I will admit, when there was a fight over the so-called puck, racist remarks were made. But some of some of my closest friends, these people, the blacks and whites,
How did that turn up in your work?
well, it hasn't materialized yet because I'm still collecting pictures about black males in Detroit. I mean, how we learned to get along. One of Rodney's closest friends was a Polish guy. When he died, Rodney showed up at the funeral, and the mother and the kids said, "The only person I want to see is Rodney, is because my husband talked about him every day of his life." This is the untold story about race in America. This story is just as interesting and as beautiful as anything you could make up.
But Dad, I feel like you have so many other sort of pet projects as a photographer that didn't necessarily materialize in your assignments. For example, your fascination with urban glyphs is what you call it, the sort of torn posters that look just like a collage or a painting. I know my dad, when I was 16, took me to Paris for the summer and taught me how to do street photography. And then we went again a few years later. And I think we even kind of tried to go to a Henri Cartier-Bresson opening and sort of like we're trying to not chase him, but, sort of like we were in search of him, kind of both literally and metaphorically throughout the summer. But we would go to walls where there was construction and there were posters and torn posters and things like that. And we would just spend an hour photographing every inch of the wall because, that was a big part of your aesthetic interest at the time. And still, you take photographs of torn posters and stuff like that in Detroit. And I feel like that's been sort of a long-standing interest of yours.
Do you have any idea how cool your dad is?
Oh, yeah. Why do you think I wanted to do this book? We did a show on the black male in Tucson where it's like you were kind of trying to depict the sort of full integrity of a subject that you, for your assignments, were often kind of encouraged to malign, to sort of contribute to an American myth of who the black male is. Because didn't you have an experience similar to this where you were asked to go photograph an event, some kind of event or outdoor picnic? And what happened?
The black family, we were doing something called, there was some event in California called the Black Family something. So I took pictures of fathers lying down on the grass with their babies on either arm and babies asleep on his chest and what have you. Women, talking back and forth to each other or just playing with their children. And I turned the pictures in and I was asked, okay, where are the booths showing birth control, handing out birth control pills? Where are the hair care products? Where are all the stereotypical images you could come to your mind when you talk about that Black family? Hair products, and all this crap has nothing to do with the Black family. But this is what my editor at the time said. You just blew this assignment. I said, no, I think I took pictures that represented what was going on there.
Well, and I just want to jump in and say, I think what I notice in your work is you have this beautiful collection of Black men with their children and Black men just occupying a space of integrity, like the photos you took at the Million Man March when you accompanied the Spike Lee film, Get on the Bus to the Million Man March. It seems like your private collection of photographs is sort of in conversation with those assignments that you were uncomfortable with, where you're sort of on your own time seeking out elders, Black elders and Black men, just sort of just occupying a space of beauty and integrity in the world.
Is perhaps the goal of the book that you're working on, is it an attempt to kind of reanalyze the photos that maybe weren't looked at, or to recaption the photos in a way that offer this secondary story, or the story that maybe the newspapers didn't want to see, that Newsweek didn't want to see in the case of this family event or others like this? I mean, is that part of the goal of this book?
Absolutely. And I think one of the stories that speaks most, I think, vibrantly to this is my father's experience documenting the fall of the Berlin Wall, which he tells in the afterword. There's a experience that I imagine he'd be happy to talk about, where that was sort of kept out of the story. Dad, did you want to tell that story of you and Pat Cole?
Pat Cole was a friend of mine. He ended up working for Time magazine. And at the time of the fall of the Berlin Wall, or let me go back a little bit more. I used to attend classes at USC, German lectures and what have you. And I subscribed to a German newspaper. And I had read in the paper that the East German government was going to make an important announcement on such and such a day. And I called the editor in New York and said, the wall's coming down. And he said, what makes you think so? I said, the wall's coming down. And sure enough, they said, well, get on a plane, go there, which I did. And it was quite an experience. Now, Pat Cole was there on a fellowship, and I told him one night, I said, they're going to be picketing around the Stasi buildings. The Stasi police was the secret police in East Germany. They're going to be picketing this Stasi building. So Pat, who's also African-American, we went there, and there were people marching around the building, singing, "We shall overcome." And they looked to Pat and I and said, join us. We learn from you. Now there's hundreds of people marching around a building, and they pick out the two Black guys in the audience and say, join us, we learn from you. I took the pictures. They never appeared in Newsweek, nor was that even a mention in the story. Now, as a result of it, to the homes of a number of East German people. They had 3 photographs in their house: Kennedy, Gandhi, and King. So the whole idea of Mr. Reagan standing up at a microphone and saying, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down that wall," is bullshit. 2 years before the wall came down, there was a singer by the name of Solomon Burke. And I was in Germany for something. I think I was in language school or something. And a friend of mine said, white Germans said, "Lester, they're going to have Solomon Burke's going to be singing in East Germany tonight. You should go." And I said, "You guys are not," he says, "No, but I got an extra ticket. Just give them to somebody. Everybody, you'll enjoy it." Well, I get there, and Solomon Burke, I found out, had been told that he could not sing one song. And that was a song by Sam Cooke called "A Change Is Gonna Come." And they said the reason is because they felt that song had too many political implications. Needless to say, at his end of his act, just the last song, this 350-pound man wearing a gold lame cape and purple pants or something like that, as soon as he said the first words of that song, 50,000 people started singing along with him. Black music was a part of the celebration when the wall came down in Berlin.
All right. On that note, we did promise you a good show. We're going to take a short break, and we come back more with Lester Sloan and Aisha Sabatini Sloan. Please stay tuned.
We hope you're enjoying this edition of the B&H Photography Podcast. The best way to support the show is by subscribing on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. For links to gear and more information on today's guests, check out the show notes in your podcast app or visit our homepage on the B&H Explorer website and join the B&H Photography Podcast Facebook group. And now, back to the show.
Okay, we are back. John, you've been raising your hand. You have a question. Go.
Yes, I do. Thanks, Alan. And again, Lester and Aisha, thanks so much for joining us. I do want to get to some of the nuts and bolts of making this wonderful book, but my first question is a bit theoretical, and it really has to do with this idea of recaptioning photos or telling the stories behind photos. And Lester, I'll start with you, but Aisha, I'd like to hear your take on it too. Do you think that the photos themselves are strong enough? Do you think that even in general that photos are strong enough to really tell accurate stories? I mean, are photos reliable, or is more needed? I mean, is a story or a caption always necessary, or do you think a photo can stand on its own?
It's possible. There are photo narratives, that images you can look at and you can read into. I remember Gordon Parks, who was a good friend of mine and teacher. He talked about his the picture of what he called American Gothic, which is a black woman with a broom standing in front, or a mop standing in front of the American flag. And the person that he shot the picture for said, "Okay, I get it. I just hope we have jobs after this." In other words, the image was so powerful in the message it was giving that no words were required. Parks was quite amazing. I mean, a number of pictures he shot like that. A picture of a mother, black mother, and her daughter, dressed to the nine, standing in front of a store saying, "No blacks allowed." I mean, sometimes no words are necessary. That
Well,
tells you all
you
of
got me
the-
on that one. I mean, you picked two of the greatest photos out there, and certainly
Yeah.
In the case of both of those, they do speak volumes. Actually, while we're on Gordon Parks, can you? And you mentioned he was a friend of yours. Can you speak maybe a little bit to the role that he might have played to black photographers at the time? I mean, was he somebody that was constantly in the conversation? Were people looking up to him, speaking about him? Was everything measured to him at that point?
You know, for most of us, it's because of Gordon Parks that we attempted to do more and to get out there and do whatever was necessary to become successful. And how do you measure success? It's not in terms of the dollars you get paid for your work. I mean, there's many jobs that pay a hell of a lot better than being a photographer.
I hope so.
Unless you're taking baby pictures, you know, I mean. But first of all, it was somebody telling him that he couldn't do something that made him determined to go out and do a hell of a lot of everything. I mean, it was like throwing down the gauntlet, you know, okay, the hell with you, I'll show you. And I remember, I don't know if you guys know of Howard Bingham. Howard Bingham was Muhammad Ali's photographer.
Right.
That's
right.
how the world describes him. Actually, that's the most beautiful love story I've ever seen. These guys truly loved one another. And people who say that, oh, yeah, but it was just one using the other. No, that wasn't it. Ali had a few wives, but as Howard told all of them, I was here before you came and I'll be here after you're gone. It was just a beautiful story. That's a story that should be told in a movie. That's a movie that's got to be made. I mean, it's.
Well, and I feel like what you're saying, there's so many Black photographers who are legends who people don't know about to the extent that we know about Gordon Parks. It's almost like James Baldwin and his influence. Right now, people seem to have the bandwidth to only elevate one great Black photographer or writer at a time, but there's so many legends, including yourself.
Well, thank you, dear.
Maybe I can jump in here, Aisha, and ask you the same or similar question that I asked your dad about the image, because you had that unique opportunity to kind of look at these images. Perhaps you were aware of some of them as a younger person, but to go back and look at them with fresh eyes, I'm sure that certain images were benefited by a recaption or a rethought. But do you think in general that the photos needed captions for stories to be told, or not necessarily?
One thing that comes to mind in thinking about this question, I remember I was taking this wonderful craft class when I was in grad school. I remember reading regarding the pain of others by Susan Sontag and on photography, and thinking a lot about, I think, war photography in particular. And I think I might even have gotten into reading Roland Barthes and just thinking about the way that photography can be kind of used, I think, as we were speaking before, in terms of this question of depicting the typical welfare mother as a kind of part and parcel to the myth making or nation building project. And so I think there's a lot of danger in letting the photograph speak for itself, because there's things that we bring to a photograph that we might not know to question. And I think with regarding The Pain of Others, I remember my dad stole my copy of that book, and we would have a lot of conversations about the implications of putting images of suffering out into the world. And so I do think that there's something to be cautious about in terms of the language of an image, and how powerful kind of internalized bias and or sort of unquestioned narratives are when we project them onto pictures. But I also think that, and in terms of the book itself, I think that there were photographs that my dad just never had the opportunity to give his take on. And so it was nice to revisit some of those and to,
And can we talk a bit about that? How you guys decided on the images to use, and how to blend images from, his professional work, personal images, and talk a little bit about the process and how you guys, work together, and when, where, how long it happened, all those things.
I'd also be curious to know if you agreed upon most of the photographs that you included in the book, and how much of was how much overlap there was as far as your choices versus your dad's choices.
I think that in a way, the story of this book started for me a few years ago when we were preparing to leave. We were moving out of our apartment in Los Angeles because, after my dad first started working for Newsweek, he moved to LA, and then my mom followed, and that's where I was born and raised. And several years ago, my parents moved back to Detroit. And when we were moving, my dad's archives made up the majority of what was on the moving truck, and that wasn't even everything. And I remember this moment where a slide fell on the floor of the garage as we were kind of, trying to move things back and forth. And it was a photograph of Steven Spielberg, I think lying in a bed of flowers, something kind of unexpected. And I just thought it was so absurd that this really incredible photograph, just emblematic of an entire life's work, was just something that could fall on the floor of a garage. And so, so I think that, in a way, the book kind of emerged out of this impulse to just sort of catalog this massive, incredible archive. And so I started interviewing my dad and recording interviews with my dad. I recently, got a job in Michigan. And so as soon as I moved here, I would drive every week and just go interview my dad about these photographs and these slides and these negatives, which it was hard to even scratch the surface of the whole body of work.
If I could just jump in for a second, did you already have the idea of a book? Was it already formulated in your head, or was it still evolving as to what form these photographs and captions would take?
Definitely evolving. I think I had sort of started filming a little bit and thought I still think it would be interesting to do some kind of documentary. But what happened was I ended up, I was telling a friend in Pittsburgh about my dad's archives and our hope or kind of vision for this house, this historic house that my dad and mom have in Detroit. That someday we could sort of build out a space for the archives and maybe have exhibits there and invite artists to come do talks and things like that, and just sort of make a residential museum of some kind and celebrate his life's work. And this person introduced me to a colleague of hers who is a publisher, and Amanda Ewell at McSweeney's, and I just had a cup of coffee one day, and she said, "This sounds like a book," because we had actually been talking about it from the angle of a nonprofit, and me just sort of chatting with her about how, because she, McSweeney's also does 826. So we were just talking about nonprofits and how all that works. And she said, "Have you ever thought about making this into a book?" And I said, that would be incredible. And so we just started playing around with the idea. And one of the editors at McSweeney's is named Erica Vital Lazare. And she was she was at the time trying to kind of create a series called Of the Diaspora. And they were trying to republish largely things that had come out, and for whatever reason, usually due to some kind of world event, didn't receive the audience that perhaps they should have received. And so we were thinking about how could a photo book fit into that, thinking about the photographs that my dad has that were actually published in Newsweek, but that in a way didn't get to have the full context of their conception. And so we started thinking of kind of trying to represent a particular era. So one of the goals of the book was to choose photographs from a particular time that was sort of in keeping with the other books that were coming out. And so we were thinking about focusing the images in the book around sort of that period of time, the 70s and 80s, which for me is the time of my father's career that I have the most sort of fascination with, because he was always sort of, I was born in 81. And so we would always sort of be driving up to the Bradley terminal, international terminal at LAX, and dropping my dad off 5 minutes before his flight. And he would be whisked off onto a plane. And I had this sort of fascination with where it was that he was going and what he was doing. And that was a time when he was doing a lot of interviews with people in different places in the world, and really just sort of caught up in this pretty magical and often sort of coincidence laden experience that I found really interesting. And so, we sort of went with that moment in his career as sort of like the container for the book.
And how much of your, let's say, of your family dynamics, or of let's say, of your admiration for your father, and or of this idea of your traveling photographer father came into the book? I mean, was examining family and your relationship part of it all, or did you try to keep that separate?
Yeah, I mean, it's the foreword for the book is definitely introduction is rooted in that feeling of curiosity and fascination that I have and have always had for my father. So I think it sort of sets the stage for the father-daughter conversation. That's sort of the setup for the book.
And Lester, were there images that Aisha selected that you perhaps had forgotten or needed to kind of think back on to reevaluate?
It's funny. Every image selected, I could tell you what I was doing and what I was wearing at the time.
Mm-hmm. And Aisha, can I ask, your father's recollections of the images and the stories that he had to go along with them? Did you feel the need to kind of push either for more information, or maybe perhaps to get something out of them that you wanted to create the story that you wanted to make with this book?
Oh, absolutely. And I would say, in terms of the family dynamic, my dad and I are very stubborn. And so I would say that there's a element in which we're sort of arguing through many of these captions, just because we're very similar to each other. And I think that I've tried to capture sort of the humor of that family dynamic in some of the captions. I absolutely, I think sometimes I was trying to get my dad to tell a story that I remembered him telling, and he would end up telling another story. So I would try to get him to go back and tell the story I was familiar with. But then often, of course, that other story might open the door to some interesting take that was far more fascinating than the one that I had originally heard. And so there was a lot of some of the conversations that we had for individual photographs were quite long. And so editing those into a caption was a bit of a artistic project in and of itself, because I didn't necessarily want to erase the tangent, because sometimes I think that's the most fascinating aspect of my dad's storytelling, although it's also the reason that there was sometimes some contention between us, because I was frustrated if he went off topic. But then when I would look at the transcript later, there was almost a poetic quality to them, because he might start somewhere and then end somewhere completely different that added an elegance to the reflection. For example, there's this photograph I'd always wanted to see that we finally found of David Hockney with his mother that my father took around the time of the '84 Olympics, I believe. And Hockney had just started doing his Polaroid collages, which I personally find absolutely gorgeous. And my dad has told me about that moment for years and years and years. And so he finally found that photograph. And he ended up telling a story about my grandmother, taking pictures of my grandmother, and sort of this relationship she had with a man in the neighborhood who took care of her after he came out of prison because his mother had died. And it seemed so off topic at the time, but it was actually this really beautiful kind of almost cinematic story that sort of allowed my dad to kind of bring something of his own memoir or biography into his reflection of the photograph. And so in that way, the captions ended up being kind of a memoir in captions. Yeah.
That's a great example.
And it also kind of goes back to my first question about, did the stories change? Did they embellish? So I guess that this is an example where there's probably more to the story than there was originally.
Absolutely. And I would say that the stories change all the time. And I think that the stories change depending on the context. And one of the things that was really difficult actually about this project is that the pandemic happened in the middle of it. So we had started out in person, and then we started talking over Zoom. And I was pregnant at the time, and my niece had a baby at the time, and we lost my mother's sister and my father's aunt at the time. So it was a very emotional time that we were sort of moving through. So I think the project was almost therapeutic in a way, but also it kind of contains a lot of the reverberation of where we were over the course of these interviews, because it was a hard time.
It gave you a framework, I guess, to work within. Every time you came back to it, there was this existing framework that you're trying to continue with, obviously with outside influences that were going on. But yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
And can I ask, how many photos did you choose for the book at the end?
How many are there?
I mean, approximately
150 or something.
I think that sounds about right. I don't have the number in front of me, because we obviously we started out with a lot more than we ended up having. But the book is about 300 pages. So,
and were those decisions that you made together in terms of editing out certain images, or did an editor come into play at that aspect, or was it just the two of you?
Dad, what's your answer to that?
Well, it seemed like a nice round number at the time. I showed a few friends the cover, and one guy looked at it and he said, that image expresses our condition today. This is an African-American friend of mine. And he said, that image, we don't know if we're floating or sinking. And so what you bring to the picture also is, for me, a consideration. I mean, what are they going to think about when they look at this book? What is this book about,
Well, and that was one of the things that actually was, I would say, the cover was something that we had to really think through, because originally, because of the sort of the 70s and 80s vibe, we had chosen a different photo for the cover that was a little bit more playful. But in thinking about what really would speak to the emotional kind of complexity of the book, it felt like, I think my dad ended up wanting to use the image that we chose of this young man in the Bahamas in the water that had a little bit more depth to it, because it spoke, I think, to the sort of complexity of what was inside a little bit more. But I would say that the process of editing down the pictures is something that I probably took the lead on because the captions were so much a part of the sort of the movement of the story. And I wanted to create a little bit of a just a kind of a beginning, middle, and end. And so the photos ended up being chosen in part because of the stories my dad ended up telling about it. So it was more of a comprehensive editing down than just the images themselves.
Interesting. I wanted to ask a little bit about your work on Get on the Bus, which was, again, that Spike Lee's 1996 movie about the Million Man March. And Lester, you were fortunate enough to be the on-set or on-location photographer.
Well, actually, I was supposed to be in the movie.
Oh, okay. So maybe you can talk a little bit about that, and then if you want, maybe reflect a little bit on what now has been 25 years since the Million Man March.
Well, an interesting story. Thinking back about the Million Man March, my daughter was going to an all-girls school in California, and she was going to take the day off of the Million Man March. And I said, well, don't do that, because what I was thinking, I said, nobody's going to agree with that, and it's just going to make you more of a target for people at this particular school. But my daughter says, Dad, this is important, forget about the person who's calling for the march. It's the symbolism of it. And I remember being chastised by my daughter about the importance of taking part in this march, which I went to, and with a certain attitude, and then afterward realized it was one of the most important life-changing experience, because I remember getting on a plane loaded down with cameras, and a guy on the plane asked, can I carry those bags for you, brother? And I said, no, I got it. He said, you look like you're struggling. I said, no, it's cool. But I said, I'm not going to give my bags to you, man. You walk down and disappear. And I said, all of a sudden, I become that which I accuse other people of being, not appreciating my own kind, or what have you. You're not trusting. And I remember getting to the march, getting to the location, and I had all these camera equipment I wanted to get passed up towards the front. And a guy said, can I give you a hand? I said, yeah. I thought he was going to walk along next to me. And he passed it off to somebody in front. And I said, oh, damn, I just gave my cameras away. And I get up there, and a guy looked at me and said, you must be Lester. I said, yeah, how do you know? Who are you? He said, I got your gear right here. And I realized that this was a life-changing event for Black men. That event was probably one of the most important events besides Obama's inauguration that ever occurred in this country. Had nothing to do with my love of Farrakhan, who I don't love. It had everything to do with my finding a way to love myself and love each other. And on that day, we were perfect. And we all grew from that. I've talked to people who went to the Million Man March, and they can tell you exactly where they were, what they did, and why they did it on that particular day. I started doing essays for NPR, I forget, in the 90s, I guess. And I was asked to do a piece about the Million Man March, which I did. And there was an editor at Newsweek who did the against. He was against the march. And we played off each other, and I was proud to be a Black person that day. Not that I'm not proud every day, but I mean, that day was just so meaningful. Now, as far as the movie is concerned, like I said, I was hired to play myself in the movie, but I didn't think I couldn't. If I'm going to document this, that I got to be focused on that. I don't know a damn thing about acting. In retrospect, I regret the fact that I didn't. But in any case, that movie, I saw the same sort of changes coming about, reliving it and making the film. At the end of that movie, everybody, the last days of shooting, when we're all in D.C. at the Lincoln Memorial, people are crying and hugging each other. I mean, it was just that kind of life-changing experience, the reenactment of it and the participation in it, the actual event.
I have to tell you, the two of you, it's been a great conversation here. The back and forth has been really wonderful, and I expected to have some really interesting insights and stories, and I'm just blown away. You two are wonderful. I hope you both appreciate the magic you have between you. As I'm telling you this as a parent and a grandparent, you got a wonderful magic between you. You do.
We know.
Good. Don't take it for granted. I don't think you do take it for granted, but I had to acknowledge it. It's so clear that you guys have a wonderful relationship.
Thank you.
Well, Lester, let me follow up on that. Can you maybe reflect a little bit on how wonderful it is to be able to work with your daughter and to kind of go back and look at your images and have not only an appreciative audience, but somebody who you can share and then pass on these, to the next generation?
Well, when I think about it, we've been collaborating ever since she was 2 years old.
Right.
I mean, first she was the subject of everything that I did, taking pictures or doing videos. She used to write about things, and I said, how in the hell does she remember that? Then I realized she had watched the video. Now when we go out on trips, if I see a picture and she sees me looking, she'll take it first.
That's not true.
That's not even fair. Come on.
That's not true. I take a picture of you taking the picture.
Yeah, but sometimes you're taking a picture that you see me walking up on, and then I have to find a way to take the same picture, but from a different angle or something else. Mm-hmm. But it's okay. It's okay. Keep me sharp.
Aisha, can maybe any last thoughts on working with your dad and kind of reassessing a set of images that you knew, as a child and as a young person growing up, but then, had this opportunity to reflect upon again?
Well, we barely scratched the surface of what he has. I feel like there's so much. Looking through the book, I almost feel frustrated at all of the pictures that didn't make it in. And one thing that's significant and that I did want to mention is that there was recently a flood in my dad's basement, and a lot of his archives were damaged, very badly damaged. So that happened maybe a week or two after we turned in the book. And so it's at a restoration company right now, but we've had to grieve a lot in the last couple of months since this happened, because this thing that we were trying to celebrate through the book was compromised and a lot of it was lost. So
that's sad. Wow.
Yeah, we're actually, it's just, anyway, the importance of trying to create a space in the house to commemorate his archives and sort of salvage everything that we can means more than ever right now.
Absolutely. Well, I'm very sorry to hear that.
Oh, yeah.
Is this negatives and slides, the originals that have been damaged?
Unfortunately, yeah. But the restoration company's been amazing, and they have, they're going to digitize as much as they can. But we ended up having to go through a lot of his slides and negatives as we were trying to rescue them from the basement. So it's kind of a difficult point in the trajectory of this story, but hopefully not the end of it.
Okay, Lester Sloan, Aisha Sabatini Sloan. It's been an amazing conversation with you guys. It really, really has on so many different levels. A great, great, great conversation. We can't thank you enough. If our listeners would like to catch up on the photographs in this book, the book itself, and any exhibitions that are going on to go along with this book, where can they go to?
Well, the McSweeney's website should have a link for the book. And it should be available in bookstores come November, I believe, 15th.
Okay, coming up soon.
Yeah.
And what about any shows, any traveling shows or existing or soon to be existing shows coming up?
Yeah, there's a show called Seeing Seen in Las Vegas right now. And my dad has 3 photographs in that. And that is the Marjorie Barrick Museum of Art at University of Nevada in Las Vegas. Mm-hmm. And then we're hopefully pandemic depending, planning to go to south of France in June for a conference on James Baldwin. My dad has some gorgeous photographs that he took at James Baldwin's home soon after the author died. But while it was still furnished and his papers were sort of still in place. And so there's a solo show of his in St. Paul de Vence, where his house used to be. So that's coming up soon.
That sounds amazing.
I'm sorry to jump in here because we are outroing, but I'm kind of curious how that came about. Was that an assignment, Lester, or was that something that you jumped on because you saw the opportunity?
I happened to be in the neighborhood at the time.
Okay, there you go.
No, like seriously, I met a lady who's an artist. She's from the States. I met her. I was on assignment in Paris shooting hotels for a friend of mine who has a publication in California. And I had some break time, so I went to Vence, where I attended a party that this woman was hosting. And no, she wasn't hosting it. She was a guest there. And she said, "You've got to come to my birthday party." And I said, "Well, I have to go back to Paris." She said, "Well, come back. You can stay with me." That was the beginning of another adventure. I came back. She introduced me to an artist friend of hers who had done a painting called Jimmy's Table, which was the table from which James Baldwin used to write in his backyard. He introduced me to the realtor who was handling the Baldwin estate. She took me by Baldwin's house and left me there for 3 hours. She said she had some more stuff to do but make myself at home.
Oh, wow.
So I photographed everything that was there, didn't touch a thing, didn't take anything. And I think some people had some doubts about the authenticity of this story, but apparently they call the artist who introduced me to the sales rep and said, "Oh, yeah, I remember Lester."
You love it.
And this, of course, I think speaks to what we're getting at to some degree, Aisha, the volume of work that's available and just, an archive itself and what can be found in a life's work. I think that's just incredible.
Absolutely.
Lester Sloan, Aisha Sabatini Sloan, thank you again for joining us. All of the links to all of the websites and all of the exhibits and the book publisher, again, will be in the show notes. So take a look at that along with some photographs of Mr. Sloan's that you definitely should take a gander at.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You are so welcome, sir. If you are a subscriber to our show, bless your photo-loving hearts for making all of this possible. And if you're not yet a subscriber, head on over to wherever you snag your favorite podcasts. Type in B&H Photography, hit enter, and every new episode will go straight to your mailbox nanoseconds after it goes live. And you can always find this on the B&H Explorer website, not to mention the B&H Photography Podcast Facebook group page. My name is Alan Weitz, and on behalf of John Harris and Jason Tables, thank you oh so much for tuning in today.